Alrighty, folks, so we're back. We've talked about all the causes leading up to the Civil War, and now we're at the Civil War itself. Just to review, because it's been a little bit of time since we've talked about those causes, I want to talk about the immediate and the long-term causes, and also look at the differences between the North and the South at the very start of the Civil War. So the essential questions for today: what factors led to the outbreak of the Civil War? Things we should know already, but I just wanted to review those, like I said, one more time, just to ensure that we do remember those, and those are kind of ingrained in your head, because oftentimes wars themselves aren't really very impactful or very important. What is important is what causes those wars and the effects of those wars once they're over. So we need to make sure that we know, first off, leading into it, what causes the war, and then once we're done with all of it, we need to know what the effects of that war is on the country as a whole, and then individually as North and South. Also, what was Lincoln's primary goal when armed conflict broke out between the North and the South? What was Lincoln doing as president? What was his primary goal? Was it to end slavery, or was it something else? Also, describe the differences between the North and the South at the start of the war, just to understand that the differences are there. And these are the reasons that really lead to the outcome of the war, with the North winning and with the South losing. The vocab, just understand what these states are: the Deep South, the Upper South, and the border states. These are all individual states within the South. Some of them seceded at different times. Others did not secede at all. Also, who is Jefferson Davis? And lastly, what is this event, Fort Sumter? Why is that significant, and why is that important? The long-term causes of why the Civil War breaks out. These are the things that happen over a course of, or over a long period of time, and lead into the Civil War. And we've talked about all of these. Conflict over slavery in the territories. We have that manifest destiny and that westward expansion. And each time a new state is admitted, the question is, what is this going to be? Is this going to be free? Is this going to be slave? And that's led to conflict in Congress and in the states themselves. We saw that in Bleeding Kansas, an armed conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Also, another long-term cause: economic differences between the North and the South. The North is more industrial. The North is more based upon a more merchant economy, whereas the South is primarily agricultural, based solely upon the growing of cotton, these cash crops that is grown through slave labor, something that is almost non-existent within the North. Also, conflict between states' rights and federal control. We saw that during the nullification crisis under Jackson's presidency. The states felt like the federal government was overreaching, that they were forcing the states to do something that they did not want to do. Also, in the realm of states' rights, the South did not feel like the northern states were enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act that got passed during the Compromise of 1850. The southern states didn't feel the northern states were enforcing that the way that they should, and they were just kind of allowing slaves to run to the north and to move off into Canada as well. And so they feel like their rights are being infringed upon. They feel like the federal government is not representing them the way that it should. And so as a result of that, they felt they were within their bounds and within their rights to exit from the Union. They felt the government wasn't representing them, so if you're going to have a government that's not representing you, that's not hearing your voice, form a different one. And that's exactly what the South chose to do. The short-term or immediate cause is the election of Lincoln. He's a Republican. He is anti-slavery, not abolitionist. He has that free soiler doctrine of not wanting slavery to spread. He's for where it's at, where it exists within the Union. However, he doesn't want it to move west. Don't confuse Lincoln as an abolitionist. He's not. He is not an abolitionist. He did not run on an abolitionist ticket. He did not want to end slavery. That was not Lincoln's primary goal, even though he's given this name as the great emancipator and this great individual who pushes for abolitionism within the United States later in the war. It's more of a war measure. Lincoln does not want to end slavery, and he says that over and over again as the war progresses, to try and get the southern states to come back into the Union. Also, immediate causes of the war: of course, the fact that the Southerns left the Union would have made it impossible for the Civil War to have happened. Had they not left, the Civil War would not have occurred. There wouldn't have been a separation between the North and the South. So with those states leaving, there's a clear divide, and Lincoln sees this as an infringement upon the Constitution. He believes they're in violation of the law, and as the president, as the leader of the executive branch, it is his job to enforce that law, to make the southern states stay. He sees this as a rebellion, less as much as a war at the very beginning, and he thinks that it's going to be very quick for him to get the southern states to fall back in line, in the same way that Jackson did with the Force Bill. Also, lastly, and this is the fuse that lights this powder keg that has been building up over time, the firing on Fort Sumter. This leads to the armed conflict. The Southern states seceding did not start this armed conflict. What began all of this was the direct military response of the South against Northern forces that occupied Fort Sumter. And we'll go into depth with that a little bit more here in a second. So the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected. That is the first step towards the outbreak of civil war. That is the first thing that gets the southern states, or really the last thing that gets the southern states kind of in such a tizzy that they decide, all right, it's time for us to leave. It's time for us to separate. With the first of those states, of course, being South Carolina, because it's South Carolina. But the rest of the Deep South falling in line, these green states down here being the Deep South, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These are the first to secede because they have some of the largest slave populations within the United States, and they are afraid that Lincoln is going to end slavery. They're afraid that's what's going to happen once this Republican president takes office. And I kind of said all of that already. In early 1861 is when these 7 southern states secede, and they form the Confederate States of America. Another confederacy within U.S. history. A previous one we talked about was the Articles of Confederation, and if we remember anything about that, we know that it's going to have a weak federal government, and it's created that way by design. The southern states want states to individually have more power than the federal government, and for the federal government to be weak. The entire Deep South seceded by February 1861. Once again, the green states down here are the Deep South. The Upper South, however, did not view Lincoln's election as an immediate threat. So they did not secede immediately, however, they will later on. To elaborate on the Constitution of the Confederacy and the nature of that government a little bit more, it's actually very, very similar to the U.S. Constitution. Keep in mind that these Southerners, they're still Americans and they hold to American values, but they have some issues that they want to address as well, and they do so in their own Constitution. So first off, primary goal, protect slavery and states' rights. They want to guarantee that slavery would be protected within the Confederacy for the entire existence of the Confederate States of America, because their entire livelihood depends upon it. Also, they want to ensure that states' individual rights are protected as well, that the federal government cannot supersede the rights of states, that the states are the ones that hold the majority of the power within the Confederacy. Additionally, they outlaw tariffs. So the primary reason for this, tariff of abomination. Also, they feel like they've been bearing the tax brunt of the United States, having to pay for these tariffs because they have so many goods that are imported into the South. And so the first thing that they do, or one of the first things they do, is go, tariffs? No, we don't want those. We got to get rid of that because that's been such a burden on the South. And lastly, they want to create a weak national government, and I elaborated on that already. They want to ensure that the federal government cannot overpower the individual states. They've had that happening throughout the course of U.S. history ever since America has become a thing, and they want to make sure that that no longer continues. That trend of federal government making the states bend to its will, they want to make sure that that trend is ended. And then this guy down here, this is Jefferson Davis. He is elected as the president of the Confederacy. But if we remember anything from the Articles of the Confederation, this individual doesn't actually hold that much power. Any president within the Confederacy is given a limited amount of power, and the federal government itself is also given a very limited amount of power. So Lincoln's response, what does Lincoln have to say about this, and what does he want to do? Well, he views secession as inherently illegal. He thinks that they're violating the Constitution of the United States, and he feels that it is his goal as the president to rein these people back in, to make them realize that they've broken the law, and he's supposed to be the guy that preserves the Union, make sure the United States stays together. He doesn't want to be the president that is known as the man that the United States fell apart under during his watch, that he wasn't able to preserve the Union. Just a little quote from Lincoln: "My paramount objection in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery." So at the very beginning, Lincoln makes it extremely clear to the nation as a whole that he does not want to do anything about slavery. He doesn't want to end it. He doesn't want to destroy it. He doesn't want to get rid of it. He doesn't want to save it necessarily either, but he understands that slavery is a hot button issue, and if he says, I want to end it, then the southern states will never join back into the Union. Instead, he says, I just want to keep this nation together. I just want to make sure that this American experiment is going to work and going to continue. So, Fort Sumter, what is that? So there are federal troops that exist within a fort down here in South Carolina. Federal troops meaning that they're northern troops. They're troops of the Union up here. And so they are in this fort. It is a federally held fort. However, it is in Southern Territory, in South Carolina, right outside of Charleston. And so the Confederacy says that they are a foreign force. These federal troops that exist within Fort Sumter are almost like an invading force. And so the Confederates demand that those troops vacate this federal fort, that they leave Fort Sumter. And so Lincoln is going to send several aides down to the soldiers, and as a result of that, seeing that these federal troops are not going to vacate this fort, the Confederates fire upon it. So it's after the firing upon this fort that eventually the federal troops are going to leave. But this armed assault on this federal fort is going to lead to the outbreak of the Civil War. This is kind of the first shot of the Civil War that's fired. So after Fort Sumter, the Upper South, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, Arkansas, they are going to secede as well from the northern states, and they are going to become a part of the Confederacy. So that's this kind of orangish, tannish color right here. They're going to leave the Union, and they're going to join up with the Confederacy as well. But that's not all the slave states. Some slave states were either forced to or chose to remain within the Union. Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri actually remain within the Union, and they are called border states. These are states that separate the Confederacy from the United States of America. They're called border states. West Virginia will eventually separate from Virginia in 1863 officially and become their own individual state, mostly because they don't have a very large slave population and they were mostly opposed to slavery. So West Virginia will separate in 1863 and become a border state. So these are the Confederate States of America. Those down here in green, with the exception of West Virginia, after 1863. Also in Oklahoma, the Native Americans that live there, they are slave owners, and they're actually going to ally themselves with the Confederacy. And then all this up here in this like light tan color, these are all going to be Union states. This is the United States of America. So the North is going to have a lot of advantages on their side when the war breaks out. Larger population, they're going to have more troops they can throw at the enemy, a greater industrial capacity, meaning they can make more weapons. They have a greater industrial power. Also, they have a huge edge when it comes to railroad transportation. About 71% of the nation's railroads exist within the North. 71% of the population exists within the North. Also, they have more farms for the growing of food in the North as well. And many, many, many more factories. The Confederacy at a very meager 14%. But the North did have some challenges that it needed to overcome. It wasn't just 100% the North had the main advantage that the Confederacy had none. First off, the North had to invade the South to win. The South did not have to attack the North at all. Also, it would be difficult for Lincoln to maintain the enthusiasm and the support and the morale for them to continue the war throughout the 4 years that it takes place. It's going to take a long time for this war to end, and it becomes incredibly unpopular, especially towards the end. A lot of people are wondering why it is they're fighting against the South when the South really doesn't want to become a part of the Union. So that's going to be a large issue for Lincoln. So the Confederacy was outnumbered, they had less industry, but Jefferson Davis knew that the Confederacy did not have to win any sort of war. They didn't have to win a conflict. All they had to do is just drag the war out long enough for it to become so unpopular that the North had to pull out and had to leave. Also, just talking about the amount of space that the North has to conquer, this area is about the size of the entirety of Europe. So it's a large area that the North has to actually get into and conquer. And it seems like a nearly impossible task for them to do because this area is just so vast. Also, the Confederacy, when they secede a large quantity of the more seasoned veterans within the U.S. military are actually going to leave with the Confederacy, one of the big ones being Robert E. Lee. But you have a large portion of very well-seasoned veteran military leaders that are going to leave with the South. So the South, though they don't have a troop advantage, they do have an advantage in terms of military experience. So that'll be it for today, guys. We're going to talk about this more in class.